Hi, it's Dr. Kim Lee, child and adolescent psychiatrist, and today I am reviewing a submission from an article that was submitted for the Australian Senate inquiry into loot boxes in video games. And this was written by researchers in Tasmania, at the University of Tasmania. I'll share with you my screen so you can see. So in 2018, they looked at gaming microtransactions for chance-based items. And as you know, in countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, they've banned loot boxes because it's considered a form of gambling in video games. And the Australian Senate, after this inquiry, determined that microtransactions for chance-based items were not considered a form of gambling under the current Australian law. I'll share with you the article written and submitted by Dr. James Sauer, PhD, senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Tasmania, and Dr. Aaron Drummond, also PhD and lecturer in psychology at Massey University in New Zealand. So their submission in brief: what are loot boxes a form of gambling? Are current consumer protection and regulatory frameworks adequate? They explain what are loot boxes and explain whether loot boxes are a form of gambling. They also look at addressing two common challenges to claim that loot boxes are gambling, or the arguments against making loot boxes a form of gambling. They look at the potential for harm. They look at the international comparisons around the world, and they also give some great recommendations, which I think I'll just skip straight to the recommendations. They identified that there were structural similarities between loot boxes and gambling, and the known potential for these mechanisms to produce maladaptive behavioral consequences. They made two recommendations on how to regulate this. So what they're saying is in games like Fortnite for children, and they're buying and spending real life money to make purchases in the game, that these behaviors, these abilities in the game can make some players form maladaptive behavioral habits. They can essentially develop a gambling problem by spending money in games such as Fortnite, which have loot boxes. They said that the loot box systems meet both the psychological and legal definitions of gambling, or in other cases where players can cash out in-game winnings. We recommend rating agencies and gambling regulatory bodies consider restricting access to people of legal gambling age. So what they're saying is that if video games such as Fortnite, which are rated G for anyone, that the gambling authorities should start regulating these games and restricting games like Fortnite to players who are 18 and above. Further, games that allow players to cash out items via a distribution platform, whether it's the actual publisher or a third party, a website which controls out the mechanisms, they might also warrant regulatory oversight as a proper gambling operation. They also say that when loot boxes meet the psychological definitions of gambling, according to the Mark Griffiths criteria from the UK, but do not include the ability to cash out winnings, we recommend that rating agencies review these games and increase their recommended minimum age despite not meeting legal definitions of gambling. These systems exploit powerful psychological mechanisms associated with gambling behavior. So what they're saying is that game publishers like Epic Games, who make loot boxes, are exploiting powerful psychological mechanisms that are embedded in gambling behavior, gambling addiction. And that games like Fortnite, which you cannot cash out your winnings for real money, they recommend that they should increase the minimum age for these games, but not necessarily make it 18 plus. They also recommend that the Australian Classification Board consider revising the guidelines to ensure all games with loot box systems that meet the psychological definitions of gambling are placed in an age restricted category, either MA 15 plus or R 18 plus. We suggest that the specific ratings given to such games should be based on revised guidelines developed by the Classification Board and depend on the prominence of the system within the game and the specific features of the system, e.g. the reinforcement schedules in operation and the odds obtaining very high utility and desirable items. So they're saying that they should increase the ratings to MA 15 plus, and that they should specify what are the odds of getting these really special skins, these special items in the games, so that people know what they're getting themselves into. They also recommend that the Australian Classification Board adopt the content descriptor simulated gambling as the Entertainment Software Ratings Board in the US has done, and require distributors to apply this descriptor to all games with loot boxes that meet the psychological criteria for gambling, next to the classification box or website of the game. So what they're saying is that video games should be classified as a form of gambling, not just from a monetary point of view, whether you can cash out your winnings or not physically, but also address the psychological definitions of gambling, meaning, the tolerance, thinking about the game a lot, the withdrawals when you're not playing, the need to increase the amount of time or money spent playing. And I'm going to look at, how they came to this conclusion. They're going to talk about the five psychological criteria considered by gambling by Griffiths in his article in 1995. They're saying that in some games, not all games, players can actually cash out in-game rewards for real-world currency, meaning the legal criterion for is considered gambling. So while the Australian Senate did not say that video games with loot boxes can cash out in-game rewards, there are actual games where you can do that. So at the bottom here, they've got an example of an Steam account, and there's a marketplace which shows that you can actually cash out items in PUBG or Player Unknown Battleground for actual money. So if you won these items here, you can actually cash it out for 0.03 cents or 0.06 cents in Australia. Okay. They also highlight that they don't know the short-term and long-term consequences with using loot boxes. But they also say that we know that these systems operate on schedules of reinforcement, e.g. programming algorithms to determine the frequency in which valuable rewards are delivered or given out or paid out. And they exploit powerful psychological mechanisms to promote rapid acquisition of behaviors that frequently are repeated and persistent, and that these mechanisms underpin many other forms of gambling. So they're saying that the game publishers are aware of the psychological mechanisms of loot boxes, and that it promotes players to keep coming back for more, keep playing again, and keep playing on a consistent basis. They also know that there is overlap between the characteristics of the people playing the games and the risk factors for developing problematic gambling behavior. That's interesting. That's a very common question that I get is, if you are playing video games with loot boxes, are you at risk of problematic gambling behavior from doing that? And I think there's definitely a link, and I'd be interested to see what they say. They're saying that the current frameworks for regulation are inadequate. In other countries, they will ban them outright or require publishers of games to specify the odds of winning. And also the UK and the US are leaving video games to be very unregulated. Loot boxes is a catch-all term for a digital container of randomized rewards. They published a paper in 2018 where they looked at 22 games released in 2016, 2017 containing loot box systems to determine if these reward mechanisms constituted a form of gambling. In some games, they met the psychological definition of gambling. In other games, they met the legal criteria for gambling. They highlighted similarities between loot boxes and conventional gambling. And they found that the psychological and legal criteria so they're saying there's a lot of similarities where there's a varying value based upon chance. There's an element of randomness in the delivery of these rewards. You might receive a very high value item a certain number of times in a predetermined algorithm. So your child might buy a loot llama and there's a predetermined value chance of winning a very high value skin or item in the game. And this is very similar to poker machine gambling. The Griffiths criteria is you need to have in gambling the exchange of money or valuable goods. An unknown future event determines the exchange. Chance at least partly determines the outcome. Non-participation can avoid incurring losses. So if you stop playing, you will avoid losing. And winners gain at the sole expense of losers. Thus, to meet the psychological criteria for gambling, a given loot box system must be purchasable for real-world currency, be accessed after payment is made, provide a reward determined at least partly by chance, be optional. Players must be able to choose not to buy the loot box, and that the fifth criterion was a little bit more complicated in that, even though there are winners, other people may not win the same amount, but they will still have an advantage over the losers in future games. They also found in their 22 games with loot box systems reviewed, 10 met all 5 of the psychological criteria for gambling. 4 of these 10 games, players could also cash out in-game rewards for real-world currency. A 5th game met 4 of the 5 psychological criteria and allowed players to cash out in-game rewards. Nearly half of the games reviewed met all the psychological criteria, and more than 1 in 5 met the cash out criterion. So the difficulty in claiming whether loot boxes are a form of gambling is that many games you can't cash out your skins for real world value. When regulators ruled out that loot loot box mechanisms are not a form of gambling, the ruling has tended to reflect the belief that in-game rewards have no real-world value, therefore loot boxes are not gambling. Some game publishers have also advanced in this argument. This argument is problematic for two reasons. First, the premise is false. For a number of games with loot box systems, players can convert in-game rewards for real currency via either third-party websites or the platform on which the game is distributed. Second, this claim rests on a very narrow conceptualization of utility. The utility depends on real-world cash value. It ignores the subjective value created for players from a combination of scarcity of and competitive advantage provided by in-game items in the gaming environment. These in-game rewards have value for players and influence the player's behavior, motivate them to engage with loot box mechanisms more often without being converted into real currency. For example, a scarce costume in a game like Fortnite may signify prestige in the game's online community, or a particular weapon might be highly desirable because it increases the ease in which they can win future games. In both cases, the item has value for the player, and this value may motivate the player to continue buying randomized rewards until they obtain the item they desire. The second argument is that nobody loses in a game like Fortnite. A second common objection is that everyone who purchases a loot box gets something, so there are no losers. An obtained reward might be of high or low in value or desirability, but unlike in more conventional forms of gambling, no one loses their money entirely. Both the rating agencies in US and Canada and the European organizations have cited this argument when explaining their review of loot boxes are not a form of gambling. The premise here is accurate. Everyone who opens a loot box gets a reward. However, some players still lose. There are two ways a player might lose. First, in some loot box systems, the functional utility of reward items varies markedly. Some items confer substantial competitive in-game advantages, and others provide no advantage. In this sense, players who receive powerful upgrades win, and those who do not lose. Second, in cases where in-game rewards can be cashed out via third-party websites, the market value for some items is lower than the cost of purchasing the loot box. Thus, the item is worth less than the player paid to obtain it, meaning the player incurred financial loss from the loot box transaction. The issue also presents a broader, more potentially serious legal hazard that we recommend the committee consider carefully before delivering their recommendations. Accepting the argument that nobody loses in the game because everyone wins the prize may set a legal precedent of illegal gambling operations more broadly, e.g. unlicensed casinos to skirt gambling regulations by providing every player with some prize following a losing game, by giving losing players 5 cents of their money back on losing a blackjack hand, for example. So what about potential for harm? I'm trying to find the link between loot boxes and gambling. Research investigating the exposure of adolescents to simulated gambling suggests that risks such as peer pressure and dilution of monetary value through exchange of real currency for virtual currency might facilitate migration to monetary forms of gambling. In a study by King and Del Fabro in 2016. Moreover, adolescents tend to have poorer impulse control than adults, potentially increasing their vulnerability to gambling-like mechanics and behaviors learned from these mechanisms. This is done by Lucia in 2014. Finally, there are some evidence that gaming population might be particularly at risk for developing problematic gambling behaviors. For example, males are more likely than females to develop pathological gambling behaviors. Study in 2009, and represented in video game population. So there you have it. Thanks for tuning in. This is a conversation that I'm hoping to continue with Dr. Jim Sauer from the University of Tasmania further, meeting up with him next week. So stay tuned and watch out for my Zoom interview with him soon. Thank you so much. Bye.